Hey folks, it's William Bellamy again. As I said in my first video, I'm going to do a two-parter here, one on Russia and China and the other on Venezuela and Zimbabwe, to talk about the effects of Marxism slash socialism slash communism has had on these countries. I think the biggest takeaway from this will be you'll see that this communist socialist workers' paradise never seems to come to fruition. It ends up in a lot of starvation and a lot of deaths. Now, going into this, in 23 years in the military, I served overseas quite a bit, some of it in former socialist countries, some bordering on socialist countries. Living in Germany, I had neighbors that grew up in both East Germany and the Soviet Union while they were still under communism. I've also seen the results in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan of what socialism and communism did to those countries. In addition, I do have a degree in international relations and economics. So I do understand the theory. I do understand the practical applications of what happened in those countries. Now, I want to start this off with a quote for Americans that may not be familiar with it. "We will take America without firing a shot. We will bury you." We cannot expect the American people to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they awaken one day to find that they have communism. That's kind of what's been happening lately. It only took 30 years longer than anybody thought it would, if you remember, because the Soviet Union collapsed right about 1990. But now some of these groups espousing socialist and Marxist ideas, and Bernie Sanders talking about socialism, and the tie between socialism and communism nobody ever wants to talk about. But Lenin himself stated that the goal of socialism is to achieve communism. If one of the greatest leaders in the history of communism says that, why shouldn't we believe him? Now, historically, Marx and Engels developed the base idea of Marxism, which became socialism and communism. And if you actually read the Communist Manifesto, the ideals seem great. It's everybody ends up with an equal outcome. Well, the problem is, not everybody can achieve that. So you have failings in the system. You also have a directed system, which means from birth to death, you will do what they tell you to do. You really have no option in this. Because if you speak out against it, if you argue it, if you refuse to do it, they have gulags or re-education camps or work camps. They have thought police that come after you. Your own child, your own spouse, your neighbor. You make one disparaging comment and they tell somebody and you get a tenner in a gulag. Is that really the life that people want to live? The Soviet Union was founded at the end of the Russian Revolution. It was a fairly violent revolution, and trivia fact for you, if you didn't know, the Americans, the British, and the Japanese all had troops in Russia in 1919, towards the end of the revolution. They were there to protect the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So that was the time they actually did fight with Bolshevik troops, unlike the rest of the Cold War. Now, moving along, the Soviet Union was based, and its first leader was Vladimir Lenin. And he had his take on what Karl Marx and Engels had to say about communism. Now, under his leadership, followed by Stalin, approximately 20 million of its citizens died between gulags, man-made famine, executions. And not only were they sent to the gulags, which were often known as death camps, when they finished their time at the gulag, then they were sent to Tajikistan or Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan to serve more time in exile. Now, at times their families were allowed to join them there, but that's beside the point. They were still sent into exile. One of them, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, wrote a 3-volume book called Gulag Archipelago that traces the history of the gulags and his own personal story, as well as stories from, I believe it was in excess of 30 people he had run across or run into or found after his time in Gulag was done. Now, when he was arrested, he was a decorated Soviet artillery officer in World War II. He had just received a medal for valor, fighting the Germans, because he in a letter questioned military leadership to a friend of his, a fellow Army officer. He was arrested, stripped of his awards and rank, tortured, and then sent to a gulag for 10 years. And he was exiled. Now, keeping that in mind, that's what they'll do to a hero. What would they do to the average person? And let me go back to that figure. Between Lenin and Stalin alone, so from 1919 to 1958, 20 million people between gulags, execution, and man-made famine when they collectivized the farms. And you'll hear about collectivism again, and I'll go into it deeper at the very end of this, because you'll see a tie-in in communist, Marxist, and socialist countries that collectivism and directed economy leads to worse positions for the actual citizens, and leads to starvation, and leads to malnutrition. Now, at the end of World War II, Mao, who was already a rebel leader in China, got support from the Soviet Union and won the Chinese Civil War, and China became a communist country as well. If you don't know the story, the reason Taiwan exists now is because that's where the Free Chinese went, as Mao took over China under the Communist Party. Under Mao's leadership, from 1950 to 1952 alone, between 2 and 5 million people were killed for counter-revolutionary acts. That could be in camps. That could have been through starvation or executions. Next, he had the Great Leap Forward, which was where he collectivized the farms and he wanted to industrialize the country, which led to a famine, which left another 30 million dead. Now, if you consider the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1958, you had 20 million dead. During the time of the Nazis, you had, well, you talk about 6 million Jews, but if you count in gypsies and undesirables and euthanasia, the actual figure is believed to be about 12 million. So the Great Leap Forward in China, Mao's first 5-year plan, actually killed more than either one of those in a shorter amount of time. Then you go forward to the Cultural Revolution, in which you go after intellectuals, you go after artists, you go after historians. There's reports, and I cannot confirm other than that there are reports, that there were times where you would have students who would beat their own teachers to death out of their belief on Mao and his little red book. Currently in China, you just had the movie Mulan come out. That's a really cool movie. I haven't watched it and won't watch it because the province it was filmed in, there's estimated to be over 1 million beleaguered Muslims in re-education camps in that same province. So think about that when you're watching that movie or you're paying for Disney Plus. And no, I'm not saying boycott it. I don't believe in boycotts. But in modern day, over 1 million Muslims, because they're a minority population, held in re-education camps. How does that sit with you? There's also a link in a description for this video to a channel called Voice of North Korea. It's a young woman, Miss Park, who escaped North Korea through China. And she also talks about what happens in China to North Korean refugees, what they have to do so that they're not sent back to North Korea to go to a prison camp or to be killed. Hey, please check out her channel. I'm not going to go to North Korea because she says it's so much better than me, and she lived it from birth to 13 years old when she escaped to China. But her journey is awesome. She's a very strong, very intelligent woman. Please check out her channel. If you want to learn more about the gulags, find the book Gulag Archipelago. He also wrote a book called Warnings to the West, which was a collection of speeches he gave in Western countries about the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union and China have 2 huge things in common, other than being totalitarian regimes where you're not allowed to think, say, or do what you want. They are the collectivization of farms And a lot of that was to push for industrialization, because they would create the state-run farms so they could move people into the industrial areas to industrialize at a rapid rate, which to a point Stalin did achieve. But he did it at the expense of the farms, which led to man-made famine because the people placed in charge of the farms didn't know how to manage them. They were not farmers. The Ukraine, which at one point was the breadbasket of Russia, went through a drought where people were starving to death. There's stories, and once again, like I said, these are stories about the citizens in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. This is before World War II. Reverting to cannibalism to stay alive. In China, the same thing happened. They collectivized the farms. People were placed in charge of the farms based on party affiliation as opposed to knowledge. Man-made famine, millions of people starving to death. And if you complain about the system, you go to a camp. If you get caught stealing grain, you go to a camp. And this is adults and children. This is not the system that worked, which is why the Soviet Union fell 30 years ago. It's why China diverted to a minor capitalism in certain areas, because you had Hong Kong that was controlled by the British, but there's also another city in China called Macau. Now, Macau is kind of a free port, if you understand the meaning, and it's also where North Korea runs a lot of their nefarious activities out of. So there's a couple of things I want to leave you with this. Whether they call it socialism, Marxism, or communism, I'll quote Lenin again. The goal of socialism is to get to communism. Now, with that, you have collectivization, which means party membership means more than knowledge. So you destroy your farms. The farmers that do work the land are pushed into working industrial jobs in cities. Once you do that, you put them in cheap apartments. You create a position because there's no food where they're standing in bread lines. But when they speak out against it, they're sent to prison for 10 years, where they live under starvation conditions. Now, over 20 million people under 2 leaders. Over 30 million under another. That's what communism brings the world. Totalitarianism, death, imprisonment, and a lack of an ability to decide what you want to do with your own life. Don't worry, they'll tell you what you're going to do. They'll give you your job. They'll tell you what level of education you're going to get to. And if you're wondering what China's up to now, Brigadier General retired Robert Spalding, he was an Air Force general, served as a senior defense attaché in Beijing. He's got a book, I'll link to the title of it, and also one of his interviews on Valuetainment, where he talks about his time in China, what he knows about their state-run 5G, why we need to nationalize 5G, why we need to divest from China. Well, that's all I have for you for right now. I'll bring you part 2 on Venezuela and Zimbabwe, which are slightly different, but they still consider themselves socialist. So, like and subscribe. If you disagree, tell me why you disagree, and share with your friends. I'm just starting out, so help me grow the channel. If you have ideas, put them down in the comments. I will read every comment. Lucky for you, I don't have that many subscribers or comments at this point. But y'all have a good evening, and thanks.